A former Alberta Premier is speaking out for Canada and ready to take on Alberta separatists. A conversation with Jason Kenney next on the Line Alberta podcast. Welcome to the Line Alberta podcast. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We are recording here in the downtown Calgary offices of Bennett Jones, where our next guest is now a senior advisor. But of course, you know him as the former Premier of Alberta, also a former federal cabinet minister, the Honourable Jason Kenney, our guest this week on the Line Alberta. Jason, great to have you with us.
Welcome to Bennett Jones. And
it's lovely here.
Great view of
yes, no kidding.
Calgary right here.
It's interesting. It's been, well, I guess it'll be 3 years this month that you officially resigned your seat, left politics, and there was a period where, you know, you had really left politics. You were quiet. I don't remember when it was exactly or what it was, but just to sort of see unleashed or unfiltered Jason Kenney emerge once again. Was there a point for you where you kind of thought, you know, maybe it's time that I lend my voice a little bit, or I feel maybe it's the right time to start speaking out on certain things?
Yeah, my take was, look, I was in elected office for 25 years, okay, since 97. And for a few years before that, since 91, when I helped to start the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, I was very active in public debates here in Alberta and nationally. So I had basically 30 years of being in front of a microphone. And I thought, like, I've had my say. It's for other people to comment on issues and stuff. But I did think, you know, through the privileged public service, I developed a certain depth on some subjects and a real passion about certain issues. And I didn't want to lose that voice, the equity I developed on certain issues, be it Alberta economic development, energy and the environment, immigration policy, defense and national security, and so on. So I decided I was going to periodically speak out on some of those issues and maybe write some stuff. I haven't done as much writing as I would like. But then I guess what you're referring to is I just started, I started to get back onto social media a bit at the beginning of this year. And I think maybe the trigger for that, the real trigger for me to get much more into commenting on stuff that I care about, was the day that Trump and Vance humiliated Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. And it was right at the same time. We saw all of these attacks from Trump against Canada. I'll never forget his January 7th, his Mar-a-Lago news conference. He was asked by a reporter, are you going to use military force to annex Canada? He said, no, I don't need to. I'll just use economic force. Right. So we had these full-on attacks against our sovereignty. We had the humiliation of this brave European country standing up to Putin's neo-fascist violence. And I just thought, I just felt compelled to speak out on some of those issues, and that's led me to speak on a few more.
Well, there's a common thread or an overlap, isn't there, when we talk about sort of the MAGA politics and for some reason, you know, hating on Ukraine or taking Putin's side. But you see that manifested in a lot of what's happening on, what do we call it, the MAGA right or the populist right. There's a big splinter right now in the U.S. We're seeing, you know, with the Heritage Foundation, everything going on there.
Commenting a lot on that.
Right. Are we seeing similar issues with conservatism in Canada or in Alberta right now, do you think?
Well, I think there is a correlation. There is an effect, a second-order effect on the Canadian conservative movement or the Canadian right as a result of MAGA-style populism. And that does concern me. You know, listen, I spent my entire adult life in the conservative movement in this country. First as a co-founder of the Taxpayers Federation, whether it was on social and cultural issues, foreign defense and security policy issues. Anybody would tell you that in the Harper caucus, I was the China hawk, the national security hawk. I was the guy who was leading the fight against legalizing euthanasia, medical assistance in dying, as it's called now. Mm-hmm. I was always a movement conservative. And what I was trying to help contribute to was a principled conservatism that was still in the broad mainstream of Canadian politics, that was therefore electable. That's what I was trying to do here with the creation of the United Conservative Party in Alberta. which was to avoid, if you will, the flaws of both the PC and Wild Rose parties, and to rebuild something more in the mold of the federal Conservative Party of Stephen Harper's era, which is to say, a principled but still mainstream conservative party. So what I see, what's happened to the Republican Party with its capture by MAGA and the echo effect here in Canada, it really does concern me. Look, I do think there is a place and a totally understandable populist reaction to the failure of elites on so many issues. Like and I've been accused of being a populist over the years, but I think there's a difference between having a healthy respect for what Preston Manning called the common sense of the common people and having a healthy skepticism of elite, or some called expert opinion. I think that can be quite healthy and necessary in a democratic culture. There's a difference between that and what I call right-wing Jacobinism. The Jacobins were the French revolutionaries who just wanted to burn everything down and saw all institutions as inherently corrupt. Right. That is profoundly unconservative. The conservative instinct and temperament is to preserve what's best about the past, to reform things, yes, but incrementally, to respect the wisdom of the past that are embedded in the institutions. And I see in certain aspects of the contemporary right, in Canada, the US, and elsewhere, a kind of right-wing Jacobinism, a kind of nasty, negative, reactionary spirit. And I'm not, having spent my adult life in the movement, I'm not going to be silent about that.
Right. Well, and there's a unique Alberta aspect to all of that, of course, in the separatist movement. And clearly the separatist movement, threats to the country. I think that's one of the issues that's motivated you or animated you. But do you feel that the Alberta separatist movement is sort of an Alberta incarnation of this broader trend in conservative politics? Or what are you seeing happening in Alberta specifically right now?
Well, I'm going to make a distinction here. I think a distinction between the hardcore separatist activists, the large S separatists, if you will, the people who belong to separatist parties or separatist organizations who get out of bed every morning thinking about it. I think that cohort is a very small cohort of Albertans, certainly less than 5% of the population. However, there is a larger share of the population who I would characterize as soft separatists or frustrated federalists.
Sure.
And the frustrated federalists, they have every reason. I'm one of them in a way. I'm a frustrated federalist, but I don't think it's productive to threaten to become a landlocked country, and I don't think it's productive to make a threat you can't keep. The significant majority of Albertans have their primary loyalty to Canada, even though they know that we've been treated unfairly, really since 1905 in some respects, and certainly in the past 10 years. So I do make that important distinction, because let me tell you, Rob, when I helped to start the Taxpayers Federation 35 years ago in the province, we would have these door-to-door membership sales guys, and I would meet them every Friday afternoon at the Relax Inn on Cloud Trail South.
Yeah.
They'd come in from all across the province, and they would tell me what they were hearing out in the back 40 as they were going door-to-door, primarily in rural Alberta. And they would always tell me about a couple of old coots they met who were ranting about some globalist, usually Jewish banking conspiracy, and they'd be handing out cartoons of caricatures like from Der Stürmer, hook-nosed Jewish bankers, and all of that kind of stuff. And I reflect back on that. We kind of used to dismiss those old coots or ridicule them. The truth is, though, if those guys wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper, the Herald or whatever, it wouldn't get published.
Right.
If they called QR77, you guys, and they started ranting about the evil Jews, you guys would cut them off.
Right.
My point is that conspiratorial mindset of extremism, there was a social edit function, a kind of social sanitation function that institutional media had. And the best those guys could do, or the worst they could do, was to wrap off a couple hundred copies of some crazy newsletter off a Gestetner machine in their Quonset hut and send it to a mailing list. But with the advent of social media, circa 2000, those people could find each other, self-publish, and create their own silos of information. I don't necessarily mean anti-Semitic, but people who with a conspiratorial mindset or an extremist mindset. And then a lot of people developed, I think, a completely understandable distrust for much of legacy media. You'll see the comments I made recently about CTV's coverage of the application of the notwithstanding clause.
Yeah.
That kind of like blind bias in some mainstream legacy media is what created the market opening, in my view, for alternative media in the both alt-right and alt-left, which have created, again, silos of information. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that people who, the kind of attitude used to be quite marginal is larger now because of modern communications. And I think it's important, with the kind of decline of legacy mainstream media, for other voices to step up in social media, and say, call out some of the nonsense that's being articulated in our society right now. As we see, the Tucker Carlson Heritage Foundation thing is exactly what this is. It's Tucker Carlson, who I think has lost his mind, platforming people with truly extremist and hateful ideas. And if we don't call this out, those of us who are authentic conservatives, there will be no conservative movement worth defending or advancing in the future.
It's interesting. It's 3 or 4 years ago. I think that, the threat you were facing, the challenge you were facing that might come from what we would call the populist right was more or less what we call the convoy movement and different issues at the time. I wonder, do you think to some extent what we're seeing with the separatist movement now is kind of an evolution?
Yeah.
A lot of the same, names and faces. I think.
I kind of went off track. I went off on a tangent a moment ago. But what I wanted to come back to is this: that I think, there is a certain cohort of people everywhere, but we're talking about Alberta, who are just perennially pissed off.
Sure.
And some of them have good reasons for being ticked off. But you're right. The same people who are ticked off about COVID restrictions or vaccines in 2021 are overwhelmingly the same people who are the most militant on the Alberta Separatist project right now. And based on what I see in social media, and I suspect any empirical public opinion research would validate this, I think they are also overwhelmingly the sort of MAGA North people, the people on social media who defend Donald Trump's attacks on Canada. And they seem to me, anecdotally on social media, to be the same people, or broadly the same cohort, who defend Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine. So you've got like just like the left has its the hard left has its what they call the unicause, like, they kind of tribally line up on a whole bunch of issues. I think you have a very similar phenomena on the hard right, and in the Alberta context, part of that badge of identification as rejecting all of the elites and all the institutions is to be part of the Alberta separatist movement. Again, I think it's a very small fraction of the population, but with the prospect of a referendum, they can cause, I think, enormous damage to political and economic stability in the province.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different. Just as there were frustrated people then who were kind of sympathetic to parts of this, as you say, there are sympathetic people now who are, frustrated people now who are sympathetic to parts of this. So when you sort of make the case against separatism or make the case for Canada, it's not really that hardcore base you're speaking to, is it?
Well, no. Look, I'm not going to persuade Federalists here. Are not going to persuade dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore separatists, obviously, and that's not the point. For me, I think you see some of these polls that will show, depending on the question, as much as like 35% of the survey respondents say that under certain circumstances they might vote for Alberta's sovereignty. Now, if you ask the question a different ways, you get that number down to 15%. So I think you've probably got something like, 2 or 3% of the province who are hardcore separatist activists, maybe 10 to 15% overwhelmingly in rural Alberta who would vote yes. And then you've got a chunk of frustrated federal people who still sing "O Canada" at the hockey games, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or they have kids who are in the military or the RCMP, or they moved to Alberta from other provinces, or they immigrated from other parts of the world, and their primary loyalty is to Canada, but they want a fair deal for the province, and they think maybe if we hold a knife to the throat of Ottawa, like Quebec has done for the past 50 years, we'll get a fairer shake. those are the people I think that need, as a federalist, those are the people I'm focused on communicating with, because I want them to reflect on how it doesn't get better. Making the threat drives away investment. Look at what happened to Quebec, 1976 to 1980 under the PQ. 250,000 people left the province. Tens of billions of dollars of capital fled. Some of the largest employers emptied out of Montreal, all because of the mere threat, the possibility of separation, even though in the 1980 referendum, the PQ only got, 38% less vote.
Yeah.
So the consequence, and by the way, I say, if you imagine, that you're going to step into the lobster trap of separation and somehow come out better, what is the main thing we're fighting for? Coastal access for our resources.
Right.
How does becoming a completely landlocked country get us coastal access? What's the separatist answer? We're going to bring the UN in to bring in peacekeepers to force a pipeline through.
Right.
I mean, if you believe that, I've got some good swampland for you in Florida. Or they say, we'll stop the trains from running across Alberta. Great. So you're going to tell Alberta farmers they can't ship their commodities to the West Coast anymore. None of that makes any sense. So I think it's important to point these things out to the frustrated federalists, that you don't get any further ahead to it. You know what gets us further ahead? It's thoughtfully, strategically fighting for a fair deal. I'll give you one example. I lined up 8 of the other provinces. So we had 9 of 10 provinces in a constitutional challenge of the C-69 No More Pipelines Impact Assessment Act. And we, damn it all, we won at the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's the kind of coalition bill. And we have been actively making the case. When I say we, Albertans, the industry, the governments, we have been making the case for responsible resource development. And guess what? We have a super majority of Canadians in every province, including Quebec and BC, who say they support oil pipelines now, and obviously LNG. So we're winning the public opinion argument. Yeah. We're winning the legal argument. We just need to keep fighting, keep building alliances and closing in on ourselves and having a political civil war and scaring away investment and dividing our communities through a pointless referendum is not how we're going to make any further progress on getting our resources to global markets.
Is that an argument against referendums, though? Is it an argument against the citizens' initiative legislation that could potentially lead to this? And that was something you brought in.
Yeah, you could argue. You could certainly say that. But listen, I've always believed that there's a place for a limited and discrete use of direct democracy as a complement to the parliamentary system when and where elites are just not listening at all to popular sentiment. I do think it's useful and important to have a pressure release valve. And but that's why I set, my government said, very high thresholds. 20% of electors had to sign a petition, I think in 60 days, in 3/5 of the province's electoral districts, to ensure that there was a real geographic pressure. And essentially what I was saying implicitly to the separatists was, okay, you guys claim you represent a majority of Albertans? Go prove it. See if you can get 20% of signatures. Well, they couldn't, and they didn't. I can't comment on why the government more recently made it much easier to access the process. But now, I hope this doesn't happen, but we may be on a path in 2026 to a very divisive referendum. But I think, regardless of how it goes, will be damaging to Alberta's future. It's
interesting because, so you got Thomas Lukaszik's effort that appears to have succeeded, and he's framing the question a little bit differently than the separatists would. But he's also saying that, well, the Premier should just put this to a vote in the legislature, and that'll be the end of it. The separatists can't do their petition because he already did one on this issue. Like, do you think there is a scenario where there's not a referendum, or does it still feel like it's inevitable in some way?
I don't think it's inevitable. I mean, look, I'm not sure what he's doing. I don't know if he's filed this, because if he has, this does not, the Initiative Act, and this is under the rules that my government adopted several years ago, as Premier Smith has pointed out. The Initiative Act does not have an off-ramp for a non-binding motion in the legislature. Like, you can do a normal petition, to that effect. And I don't know if he's held this back from Elections Alberta or withdrawing it, or they'll time out because they don't have the resources to validate verify the signatures. So there's all those technical questions. But okay, so you've got 400,000, 500,000 signatures. You can take that to an MLA and ask them to table it, or send it to the clerk of the Legislative Assembly and ask for, informally ask for that to trigger a debate. And that's a conventional point effort to petition Parliament or the legislature, which is an ancient right of citizens. So, but I've never understood what they're trying to do. Like I'm an unqualified federalist. I've always been clear about that. And yet I just think this was too clever by half, because I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the separatists could meet the threshold. So why would federalists help them to get the ballot that they want? And in order to maybe have a slightly different wording on the question, is some tiny notional tactical advantage worth the huge strategic risk of a deeply divisive, multi-month debate over our place in the Federation? This is not like something that's come and gone. These things would go on for months. A campaign, a referendum, millions of dollars would likely be spent on both sides. Every day, this would be the subject of media coverage here nationally, and then eventually it would become international coverage. You know what's going to happen if that gets on a ballot. At some point, a guy in the White House is going to be watching Fox and Friends, and you'll see that there's a referendum on separation in this oil-rich Canadian province, and you know what kind of mischief that could invite from south of the border. You know that I do a lot of work with major businesses globally now. I was at a major investor conference, in New York City a few months ago, and when they heard I was former Premier of Alberta, the only question they wanted to ask me was, how serious is this threat of separation? Yeah. The implication of their question was, is Alberta a place of elevated geopolitical risk for our capital? So I think, if I don't care whether it's a separatist-sponsored referendum or a Thomas Lukaszuk-sponsored referendum, that will take us in no good place in terms of investor confidence, social cohesion, and our role in the Federation.
I think the Prime Minister...
By the way, and so what? So we get to a referendum, and let's hope, like I say as a federalist, so 75%, whatever, vote to stay in Canada. Okay, great. It's an affirmation by a supermajority of Albertans, but you're still opening the door to a significant minority, creating a permanent political fact. It never went away in Quebec. They lost badly in 1980, and they came back in 95, and the PQ may win again on a commitment for another referendum. Once you unleash this kind of political movement and demonstrates that it can have some substantial support, I think it becomes a permanently divisive factor in our politics and therefore our economy.
To what extent can the Prime Minister change the facts on the ground? I think there's certainly some things the Prime Minister could do that would almost be a knockout blow to the separatist movement, right? Yeah,
no, for sure. There are, to address this fund, look, he could, the government of Canada could respond positively to everything that I used to ask for from Ottawa, that my successor is asking for from Ottawa. Emissions cap, industrial carbon price seed, tanker ban, go down the list. You could tick all of those items off the box, and that would still not satisfy the hardcore separatists. So let's be clear about that. They cannot be satisfied. They will not be satisfied. But it's the question of those frustrated federalists, which I think are, depending on the day and the temper of the public mood, that's like, 20 to 50% of Albertans are, I think, in that category of frustrated federalists. They tend to be kind of center-right voters. They tend to be in or adjacent to the resource industries. Now I think that Ottawa can help to deflate frustration in that group very substantially. And I think they are taking some positive steps in that direction. I think the very end of Justin Trudeau's tenure was a big step in that direction. The signal in this budget of not implementing the emissions cap the elimination of the retail carbon tax, the apparent openness to a potential coastal pipeline, certainly further the federal government doubling down on a commitment to LNG exports. These things are all helpful. I wish the Prime Minister was doing this with greater focus, energy, and clarity.
Yeah.
I've tried to convey this message to people in Ottawa, which is they should take the situation here seriously, and they should not assume that just because a majority of Albertans are Federalists that this is going to be an easy, this is going to be a walk next year.
Right.
Ottawa needs to do its part to demonstrate that it values Alberta as a key engine of the Canadian economy, responsible resource development to get out of the way. And I think they can do that without completely abandoning the Prime Minister's environmental preoccupations.
In the meantime, it looks like we might be voting on other issues next year. And maybe that's the same kind of sort of safety valve approach that you talked about, right? Because you had the Fair Deal panel, we had the vote on equalization. Feels like we're kind of doing that again with Alberta Next, and who knows what we might be voting on next year. Do you think that eases tension, or what do you think the experience was for you of having gone through that? Did it release some of this tension, or did it build it up further?
No, I think it did release a lot of tension. What happened? So, 2015, the Notley NDP is elected in Alberta, and then a few months later, the Trudeau Liberals in Canada. The same time, there's a downturn in commodity prices. Yeah. So you've got a triple whammy. In my perspective, I think the perspective of most Albertans, you suddenly got a provincial government that the NDP had always been, let's face it, hostile to the Alberta oil and gas sector. They always believed it had a morally corrosive effect on Alberta's political culture. I think Ms. Notley became a little more pragmatic in office, like with her royalty review that she parked. But you had that kind of that basic disposition of hostility to the energy sector from Ottawa and Edmonton, and then you had the price downturn. And that created huge frustration. And then when Trudeau was reelected in 2020
or 19, yeah.
Excuse me. Can we edit that out? Yeah. When Trudeau was reelected in the fall of 2019. We certainly saw a spike of anger, of alienation, of frustration. And I thought we really needed to address that. And, we had already committed to a bunch of things, the constitutional challenge of the carbon tax, which we lost narrowly, the constitutional challenge of the Impact Assessment Act, which we won, the constitutional challenge of the plastics ban, which we won. We got an equivalency agreement to let Alberta manage industrial emissions pricing in a practical, sensible, market-based way. We got an equivalency agreement to manage northern caribou habitat, which I know is kind of it's not a sexy issue, but had the feds and Stephen Guilbeault taken charge of that, he would have sterilized about a quarter of the landmass of Alberta from economic development. So we won on some very big and consequential issues, but people still wanted to see more, pressure behind the fight for a fair deal. That's why I created that panel. And there we opened the discussion on things like adopting the sorts of powers that Quebec has long exercised with its own provincial police, pension plan, and so forth. So I do think those are legitimate issues. I don't understand. I do think, Rob, that I think some of the Alberta elites are so reflexively hostile to those things. I don't understand why they don't understand that Alberta cannot exercise the same powers that Ontario and Quebec do, that Quebec does in particular on some of those issues. So I think, this is it's a province of now 5 million people, right. Wealthiest province in Canada, the best educated province in Canada. I think we can manage things like our own pensions and our own police better than Ottawa. I think we can follow the Quebec model on that. That's my own view. And I think those are totally legitimate issues. And I think at least having those debates can demonstrate to the frustrated Federalists that we are open to exercising more power within the Federation.
I think the challenge, too, and the sort of utopia that the separatists paint of what a separate Alberta would look like and all of these things, when you make these incremental gains, it still falls short of this hypothetical that they present. And I think that's the challenge, right? In saying, we've made some gains here. This is better than it was before. It's still not this lofty la-la land that they describe.
This kind of cloud cuckoo land that we're going to solve the problem of being a landlocked province in the Federation by becoming a completely landlocked sovereign state, which would immediately lose market access to the rest of Canada, unless the rest of Canada decides to grant us that access, would lose our participation in CUSMA, USMCA, NAFTA free trade, all of the other trade agreements which our commodities industries depend on. And by the way, a lot of this is about coastal access for pipelines for oil and gas. I assure you that if you talk to any of the major producers of oil and gas right here in downtown Calgary, they're going to tell you the idea of separating is nuts, that they won't get any pipelines built. It'll be more difficult to develop our resources. So it is, you know what? The whole separatist concept in Alberta is just political masochism. And I just think, I don't see enough federalists calling it out. I think there's a lot of my kind of fellow travelers who are just hoping this thing goes away and are not spending any time or energy on rebutting these ridiculous claims. Like I said, I was in a discussion a few months back with somebody I would characterize as a soft separatist who's actually quite an intelligent and thoughtful person. And when I said, like, how does getting landlocked solve the problem of resource exports? And he says to me, oh, you don't understand. If they don't give us coastal pipelines and access, we'll, as I said earlier, we'll just block the trains from running from BC to central Canada. And I said, so then they block our rail exports, so our farmers can't sell anything anymore. Saskatchewan can't export its potash through Alberta anymore. All of the imports we depend on that we get from the Asian market, we can't. Like, this is just nuts. Nobody has thought more than the most important question in politics is then what? Yeah. No one's asked the first order then what questions of the separatists. They get a free rein, and I think it's time to more seriously challenge them on their BS.
Well, and I think part of what they say, which sounds compelling to a lot of Albertans, is that, well, we're not getting it anyway. So we'd be no.
We are, but we are incrementally. That's the point. Yeah, incrementally. I mean, look, Lord knows I was not a fan of Justin Trudeau, but to his credit, having screwed up the investor confidence situation on Kinder Morgan, it wasn't just him. It was the BC NDP. It was the uncertainty around Indigenous consultation. It was a lot of things, but he stepped in and got that done against opposition from many in his own government and his voter base. And now we are selling. We've reduced the price differential. We've increased the value of our oil. We're selling 500,000 incremental barrels out there. And by the way, TMX can, through optimization on the current easement with basically the current infrastructure, could lift that by another 250, 300,000 barrels a day. Coastal GasLink, first part of Train 1, done. Next part will be done in a few months. Train 2 will proceed. The government has identified that, plus wood fiber, plus the other LNG West Coast projects. So we're going to be significantly up on gas exports. I think that, by the way, what I call the son of Keystone XL, KXL 2.0, could be a judo move to get Trump to buy into additional exports from Canada. Could open up egress of another 1 million barrels a day. I was just in Ontario, the provincial government has appointed a task force to see how can they advance oil and gas pipelines across Ontario. You got the Premier of Quebec coming back to being pro-LNG, pro-gas development, at least rhetorically. So as I say, we're winning in not unconditionally, but we apparently have killed the feds have killed the emissions cap in this recent federal budget, which was a major constraint. Because what's the point of building additional egress if you can't do additional upstream production? So I think, things are going in a positive. We've got to look at the huge progress we've made on Indigenous support.
Oh yeah.
And David Eby's theatrical opposition to West Coast oil pipelines. I mean, he's already lost. They lost 4 years ago at the Supreme Court of Canada, which said BC has no constitutional standing to interrupt or regulate interprovincial infrastructure, including coastal pipelines. So we've won at court on that. We won on the Impact Assessment Act at court. We've got like 80-90% of Indigenous communities in Western Canada on side with responsible resource development. We've figured out how to get them equity participation through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which my government created. It's been replicated, BC, Ottawa, Saskatchewan. And now those Indigenous communities can have an ownership stake in these projects. So you've moved the dial on Indigenous support, moved the dial on political support, clearing out some of the legal obstacles, and actually getting some pipelines built. Yeah. So this is not the dire situation that some would describe it as. And I want to point out, by the way, this shouldn't be a partisan question. So much of this is about frustration built up during the Trudeau era.
Sure.
When I was a Harper minister, I don't remember anybody in Alberta coming and saying that we should separate. And frankly, very few people when Jean Chrétien was prime minister. I saw Mr. Chrétien recently, and I said, Mr. Chrétien, I want to thank you. When you became prime minister, we were producing 2 million barrels a day of oil. We're now producing 6 million. The gap was almost all projects that were built that you were greenlit under your government, that you incented and that you approved when we had a pragmatic pro-growth Liberal government that actually believed in resource development. So my point is, my message to my contacts in the Carney government is, be more like Jean Chrétien.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I think if Pierre Poilievre was the prime minister, I don't know if we'd be sitting here having this conversation. I think so much of the political tone in Alberta would be completely different.
You would still have that micro minority of the hardcore large S separatists. It would still be, basically these are the people that voted for Maxime Bernier's party. Right. I mean, let me just test this, by the way, because we spend so much oxygen on that movement. Since 1980, which is generally acknowledges the birth of the separatist movement in Western Canada because of the NEP and the re-election of the Trudeau government, the patriation of the Charter, and all of those things. You had the first manifestations of Alberta separatism. There have been, by my count, I think 12 federal and about 12 provincial elections in Alberta since then. And I did some math on this. I think about 2,300 federal or provincial parliament or legislative seats available for election over that 55-year period, during which they elected one MLA for like 6 months in one riding at the height of the NEP. And in that same riding, in a recent by-election, as you know, the Separatists came a distant third behind the NDP. Yeah. And then in Pierre Poilievre's by-election in Battle River Crowfoot, East Central Alberta, perhaps the most right-wing riding in the country, there were two Separatist candidates that between them got less than 1%. And what was Poilievre's the slogan? Canada first, Canada last, Canada always. His T-shirts were going around Battle River Crowfoot wearing maple leaves on their T-shirts saying Canada first. So, when actually tested at the ballot box, these people turn out to be the 1%, or like the 5% in rural Alberta that voted for Maxime Bernier's party, or was less than that. Yeah. So I don't think that faction should be able to dominate the political direction and debate in the province and cause all sorts of second-order negative effects, like a lack of investor confidence.
It may still happen. And I guess that's kind of where things are at now. We don't know what 2026 has in store. It's possible that there will be a referendum. Are you planning to be then, if there is, an active participant? How do you see your role going into a potential campaign like that?
I'll certainly share my views, and I don't know what role, how that would shape up in terms of a campaign or whatever, but I would certainly want to do my part. And I know I can already hear the largest hardcore separatists sneering me with it. They would love me to be active in such a campaign. I think that actually most, as Ralph Klein would say, severely normal Albertans, like the 55% who voted for the UCP when I was the party leader in 2019, remember that I was, as Don Braid said in a recent column, no Alberta Premier done more to defend the province's role in the Federation than I had. So whether it was challenging the carbon tax, the Impact Assessment Act, the plastics ban, all of those issues, repealing the retail carbon tax, whether it was setting up the energy war room or creating a coalition of other provinces to back us up on a bunch of these issues, or whether it was opening the discussion on Alberta provincial police and pensions and so forth. I think I demonstrated that I have been very strong on defending Alberta's sovereignty within the Federation. And so I think that we need the debate to be, if we get into a separatist referendum, I think we need the debate to be led in part by those of us on the center right who believe in a strong Alberta. If it's, to be blunt, if it's just Nahit Nenshi and Thomas Lukaszuk, I think that's, or people who are seen as mere supplicants of Ottawa, who were silent or cheering on Justin Trudeau during his decade of attacks on this province, I think that would be hugely problematic. So I would say to my, I respect people regardless of their views. I respect my fellow Federalists, but if they're coming at this from a Ottawa always knows best perspective, that's probably not the best way of dissuading frustrated Federalists from casting a send a message vote, which could move this from a 10 or 15% vote to a 30, 35% vote.
Yeah. Well, I can also think of another former politician, a former prime minister from Alberta, whose voice might be powerful in this
There's
context.
there's a lot of conservative Federalists in this province who could be very effective, and I'm sure would come out and speak to this at the right moment. I got to tell you, I coming back to where we started this talk, it was Trump's attacks on Canada and then his humiliation of Zelensky, which I just couldn't be silent about those things. It kind of got me back into public debate. And it was not long thereafter that Prime Minister Harper said at an event in Ottawa that we should be prepared to pay any economic price, any price that was required to defend our sovereignty and not to become to defend our sovereignty against these attacks from Trump. So I think that Stephen Harper has a very clear-eyed view about these things, both Canadian sovereignty and national unity.
And I guess being in the public debate doesn't necessarily mean being back in politics.
Yeah, no, I don't think it does. And there's some certain parameters I try to follow. I don't think it's I get asked by media almost every day, or certainly every week, to say something critical about my successor. I don't do that because I just think it's you got to respect. That's a tough job for anybody to do, and having your predecessors chirping is I wouldn't have appreciated it. And so I try to avoid punditry. I get invited to go on all these panels and everything. Try to avoid that, and it doesn't mean me going on a ballot. But I'm sorry, I spent as I say, 30 years trying to build a conservative movement in this province, in this country. 25 years of elected life. And I come from a family that has been, every generation of my family has been in Canada's uniform or in the British uniform, defending Canada, and before it, British North America, going all the way back to the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Fenian raids, the two world wars, the Korean War, the Cold War. So I'm sorry, my blood runs red. I'm a proud Westerner and an Albertan. And I think the vast majority of Albertans are the same way. I remind the separatists that Alberta is the most Canadian province because of the huge interprovincial migration to this province.
Yeah.
People who chose are Albertans by choice, not chance, who have adopted Alberta's work ethic and entrepreneurial culture and are proud of this province, but who are also loyal Canadians and are not going to let a crew of perennially aggrieved, angry folks drive us out of our country. There's another thing about the separatists. You get three of them in the room and they've got at least 5 opinions. I mean, I think in the 50 roughly 50-year history of Alberta separatism, I have counted at least 16 different separatist parties that have come and gone, merged, demerged, been deregistered, because they can't even get along with themselves. So as I say, I think that the vast majority of Albertans, proud of this province, understand the unique characteristics of this province, want a strong Alberta. People like me who believe we should be exercising more powers that we can, like Quebec, but still Canada first, Canada last, and Canada always Canadians.
Well, we'll leave it there. Jason Kenney, thank you for this, and look forward to hearing more from you in the months ahead.
Cheers.
There you go. That is former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. We'll leave it there for this week on the Line Alberta podcast. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe, alberta.readtheline.ca. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We will talk to you next week. Take care.